Hello, good afternoon. It is 1 o'clock and thank you so much for joining our accommodation discussion today. I can see the attendees are coming in thick and fast. We have got 500 people registered for this particular webinar, so no pressure, panelists. 500 people, that's a lot of people looking at your faces. Okay, Belinda is in a very, very exotic place, so her internet connection does not allow for video, so you won't unfortunately see her video, but she is going to be our moderator today. But before we hand over to Belinda, I just wanted to hand over to David to give us a welcome. David, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. This is the second webinar we're having today on looking at protocols in terms of opening the tourism sector up. We had a particularly good session on transport this morning, and looking forward to insights on accommodation in the next hour. So just a brief background on why we're doing this. We're doing this through the Tourism Business Council, which is our peak body. Historically, when we look at government looking at the sector, we generally are not consulted. We have heavy-handed regulations, we have unintended consequences, and generally we get screwed. So what we're trying to do here is to get ahead of the curve and to put forward a set of protocols that shows government we're ahead of the game. We know what we're doing in terms of an opening up of the sector. We're also trying to channel it so that we have one set of minimum standards that we can put forward that everybody adheres to. And this is far more preferable than getting 100 people charging off in 100 different directions. I'm really grateful for all the panelists that have agreed at really short notice to come on board. We've got to get this in by Thursday afternoon. And it's just great to see the industry leadership stepping up. And a lot of the people you're going to be hearing from this afternoon have done an incredible amount of work. We saw that in the transport session earlier. So that's in a nutshell where we are going. We also, just for the record, are having conversations next week. I've already been in touch with our Aussie counterparts. We're having a Zoom chat with the New Zealanders and the Aussies next Wednesday to try and look at coordinating this across the Southern Hemisphere for long-haul travel, which I think would be useful. And then just a final point from me, just in terms of an update. We have had, I think, over 700 applications for the UIF and the TERS support. There have been reports that a lot of this is creaking and groaning. I think there have been some capacity issues. I've raised those with the CEO of the TBCSA. He's in consultations with the Commissioner. And we will be getting a statement from the TBCSA later on today. But just want to give everybody a sense that we are cracking the whip and kicking bums. It's not a question of just sitting back and twiddling thumbs. So with that little mixed metaphor, I'll leave you. And thanks so much, Belinda, for stepping up. Final point, we just have on all these webinars, we've got a SATSA board member coordinating and moderating. And Belinda McIntyre heads up sales and marketing at Soho, has been a stalwart on the SATSA board. Belinda, thanks for doing this and good luck. I'm going to clock out now and listen to the seminal insights. Thanks so much.
Thanks, David. Before I hand over to Belinda, I just want to remind all of you, please, to input as much as you can. This is our protocol. We need to help this team put it together. In terms of how one does that, you obviously can't talk, but you can text. So you can do so on the chat. So if you click on the chat bubble, you can send us a message via the chat. You also have access to a Q&A folder. So if you click on the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A folder. You can type your question there and we can deal with it as the panelists. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Belinda to get us kick-started. Belinda, over to you.
Super, thanks so much, Natalia, and thanks, David. I think this is really great that we've managed to get this panel together here today at such short notice. So I think we all agree that it's really not business as usual in the imminent future, and today we wanted to focus on jointly mapping out safety procedures and guidelines as an industry in order to really safeguard tourists as well as staff, but also to instill confidence in the travelers to South Africa especially. So I think if I'd like to just introduce the panel quickly. We've got Rob Moore online, from More Family Accommodation. We've got Tim Lowe from Atlantic Point Backpackers. Brent Dixon has joined us from Dream Hotels and Resorts, representing the resorts, the hotel self-catering. And then we've got Teresa Emmerich as well from Knightsbridge. And Teresa represents 8,000 guest houses and B&B. So we've got a really, really great team of panelists here today. So I'm going to kick straight off into this. And Rob, if I can start with you, because I know More have already done an enormous amount of groundwork on hospitality life post-COVID. So you've engaged with a dedicated physician to assist you in safeguarding your environment as well as behavior. Can I ask you maybe just to take us through some of the key learnings and outcomes you'd like to share with the industry?
Sure, Belinda, sure. So first of all, our approach is very dynamic. You know, this is not a long-term sort of procedure that we envisage. You know, we assessing, as I suppose all of us are, information that is coming to hand weekly. And so therefore our kind of recommended practices are good for today, but they may not be good for tomorrow. And I think just referring back to Natalie's comment in terms of, you know, we really want to build confidence, or rather reduce fear for the traveler to get traveling again and visiting properties, and then also slow the spread and support the government in terms of their objective in reducing the spread of COVID-19. So, you know, and again, you know, this is not we know that it's a very contagious virus, and we know that it's actually going to permeate our communities and our society. So these are all just preventative measures to reduce fear and to slow the spread. You know, the simple tips and tricks in terms of at property, you know, I'm talking specifically to, although we play in both the lodge and the hotel space, I'm speaking specifically to lodges, which are a little bit different in terms of their geographical location. We I guess, operate as islands, and therefore it allows us to control the possible infection coming in, both from guests who would be arriving as well as staff who are coming in. So a couple of things we've actually, I mean, I don't want to occupy too much time, but we've actually put it on our website where we've listed all the different on-property preventative measures, from you know, individual dining, from safaris. We've dropped some from 6 people per vehicle to 4 people. We've also created, I suppose, the opportunity, and that's why this is dynamic, is while we have available rooms, we've also introduced temperature testing, which is it's not a guaranteed, as we all know, and this is through the advice of the physician who's been working with our company for a number of years, is your temperatures will vary. It's not a dead cert on whether your temperature is up, do you have the COVID virus, but at least it's seen as a preventative, proactive measure that we're taking. So we're going to have temperature that we will do both staff in the morning as well as guests during the day in a non-offensive, a non-invasive way. And then in that, we've dedicated certain rooms at the properties so if people do have a temperature, and again, it needs to be done carefully and sensitively, because you don't want to sort of hustle someone to a room because their temperature's up. It may not be a guaranteed. So these are the bits, the little kind of actions that we've taken into our operations to try and restore confidence and get people moving again. We've also got a lot of support in case someone is identified with COVID-19. Then, you know, we've set up, a call to a doctor. We're able to isolate the individual, be it a guest or a staff member, and then follow the recommended process. So, I mean, my best recommendation, and I hope it adds value, is to go to our website and grab and use the information, use what you find is relevant to your world or not. And that's sort of what we've done in the interim.
Sorry to hijack you, Rob. Because it's so good, I actually just want to share what the infographic looks like. Sorry, Belinda, just wanted to actually share the screen, because I think this is such a great way of presenting information in an easy format. So for those of you who can actually see my screen, hopefully all of you, you'll see that this is the infographic that Rob and his team have put together, and it's absolutely brilliant. We don't need to do 10-page documents on showing staff and guests what to do. If you do things visually like this, you actually get quite far. Sorry to hijack, back to you guys.
No problem. And as I said, I mean, another thing we've done, and I hope it adds value, I mean, you may or may not consider it, but it's so relevant that, and we know our websites are the front of our shop. So we only recently, as recent as actually yesterday, we've now put a dedicated page on our website about this. So, and I think that again just links back to restoring confidence, be it in the domestic market or the international traveler, that first of all, we're aware of it. Second of all, we've been proactive in taking certain measures to ensure that we're considering both the staff safety as well as the guests.
Rob, thank you. And I think from my point, if I can just, what the other thing that I took away from what you had highlighted is that you had really touched on medical care in South Africa. And I think that has got such an uncertainty and a perception. And I really think that was a stunning drive from your side, just to say, guys, we do have exceptionally effective medical care here in South Africa. So well done on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Tim, if I can ask you, what is your take on check-in and check-out procedures? Do you believe this is going to be moved to a digital space? Do you believe that there's going to be a bigger drive on self-check-ins, cardless keys? I know that's taken off quite a little bit overseas. And do you think temperature screening is going to be an absolute necessity?
So, Belinda, with and understand is just a line of defense. So it's a precautionary measure, and I think it should be done. And as Robert said, morning, afternoon, more than once a day. There's nothing wrong with that. As far as it goes with the check-in procedure, my recommendation would be to get guests prepaid in advance, digital documents sent via email or an online form on your website. So we're not transferring paper and pen at the reception desk. As far as key card goes, this is going to be a tricky blanket brush. It's a huge investment. It's a capital outlay to get those installed into smaller guest houses or small boutique establishments where a key is their simple go-to. What we've done prior to lockdown was installed a hand sanitizer and disinfectant spray at every single door. So our guests, if they felt uncomfortable at any point, could disinfect the handle with a cloth and then sanitize their hands. The check-in procedure, again, it's going to sort of be the same as for me, I visualize going to the shopping center and buying something at Woolworths where there's lines and lanes. But the more we can do pre-arrival, the better.
Fabulous. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for that. Brent, from a hotel perspective, restaurants, conference space, how do you see the future of seating and serving arrangements, be it food menus, be it buffet versus a la carte, the layout, kitchen staffing? What changes do you think that we need to implement straight from the get-go?
Thanks, Belinda. I think, yeah, you know, obviously, I mean, that's probably a very high risk area in the fact that, you know, that's where a lot of your communal kind of, you know, collectiveness is going to happen. So I think that's where you've probably got to apply a lot of focus to. Really, I think what we've kind of obviously is just followed the kind of best practice from a global perspective in terms of trying to obviously spread out our restaurants as best we can, obviously try and move dining outside where we can. Unfortunately, we are going into the winter at the moment, which doesn't always, you know, lead itself to kind of sitting outside in the evenings and things, but where we can, we'll obviously try to do that. We've obviously, you know, spoken about just at our properties where we can maybe even look at doing sort of private dining at the respective units or within the rooms. You know, again, that just lends itself based on the property and the, you know, the ability to do it on a large scale and whether they can or can't do it. Other things we've obviously looked at is just changing our menus, in particular from properties where we've had buffet type setups is rather to try and move to a a la carte style menu or a table d'hote, something along those lines where there's less kind of risk of contact from from the guests. And a lot of it, I think, Rob also spoke about it, is guest perception and also staff perception. I think that's something that we need to manage. It's quite, obviously the situation's fluid, and it's very difficult to ascertain at the moment the kind of level of the concern that that guests are going to have. So I think it's obviously you've got to show as that you are doing as much as you possibly can, and I think we'll obviously adapt that as we know, and as the situation unfolds. Moreover, we've also spoken about where our units do lend themselves to a family suite or something along those lines. We've even kind of spoken about maybe creating sort of family meals where we'll go and drop off a roast chicken and a kind of pre-cooked meal for that family, so they don't have to come to the dining room or to the restaurant. They can actually they can eat at home in the privacy of their house. So we've considered all these various aspects. One of the things we've obviously spoken about is from a staff safety perspective. We've discussed gloves and masks. We've actually taken the approach at the moment to rather tell our waiters not to wear gloves. And I know that might sound a little bit controversial, but we've said that we felt that where guys are forced to wash their hands, often they're a bit more kind of focused on hygiene, and often at times probably a bit more conscious about it rather than wearing gloves, where sometimes it can spread a bit easier. So there's lots of different aspects coming from menus through to the way you set up your restaurants, through to alternative dining aspects. So there's obviously a lot that can and can't be done, and it really is property dependent as well.
Thanks, Brent. And then can I ask you, because there's quite a few questions coming in around luggage sanitization, and I know we've seen it as well, and I think the adjacent to that is, when luggage changes hands to obviously the transport companies, where does the responsibility sit? But how do you envisage us handling the luggage?
So that's actually a very good point. I mean, that's something that we haven't really considered, and we've kind of focused on the kind of high areas like restaurants and reception and housekeeping and etc. But I think it's a very valid point, because you're going to have different parties touching the luggage at different sort of aspects along the way, and I think it's something that we really need to kind of consider and give thought to. My sort of gut feel would say that where you've got porters, obviously they need to be, follow the correct protocol in terms of hygiene, cleaning, have sort of sanitizers and wipe downs for things like suitcase handles, just to try and really kind of obviously prevent any spread of the virus. And then otherwise, I think, what we've also spoken about, and this is something that is really also property dependent, is to try and maybe give clients options. We've spoken about in certain of our properties, and I know you'll probably get to it just now in terms of housekeeping, but where if a client is uncomfortable with, say, a housekeeper or a porter touching their bag, that we'll give them the option to potentially do it on their own basis, so they can which I know is against generally our hospitality kind of service standards, but given this the situation, sometimes you just got to kind of think differently and what actually ultimately the client wants at the end of the day. So I hope that kind of helps and assists with an answer.
Thanks, Brent. I think let's come back to that one as well, because I think that a few people have got some ideas around that. So we'll come back to that. Tim, if I can just come back to you, there was a question now when you were speaking around backpackers sharing rooms. Do you think that hostels are going to phase this out? Do you know if there's an ideal number in terms of persons sharing a room? What?
Thanks, Belinda. I lost you there at the end. This is a touchy subject. So speaking with some of my peers, it seems that some haven't considered it and some have. So the jury's out. But I would say for the period Rob spoke to, we don't know how long this will last, but for the next step, it will probably be something that where backpackers don't use their top bunks any longer, and the sort of the sardine run it's going to have to be spaced out. So we need to allocate a specific square meter range around the bunk bed. And it's somewhere between 4 square meters and 5 square meters for a bed space that is going to be acceptable. I know Western Cape government have been talking around 5 square meters. So if we start to think that way, for me, 4 square meters is a lot easier to just deal with. It eliminates the top bunk completely. So our dorm rooms are going to have to be running at 50% occupancy at best. If you got a barrack style dorm room, you probably going to have to reconfigure how they are configured within the room so that people aren't passing down a tunnel or a thoroughfare where they can infect everyone along the way. So I have given it some thought. Basically, I think if your room's big enough, you're gonna maybe, because we're in the youth space, I guess won't mind too much, but almost outline your space where it's acceptable for that person's bed. No one's allowed to enter their space. If you can just imagine a zone lines on the floor. I don't think that it's a blanket that we can say maximum of 6 people per room or 10 people per room. It's going to depend on the size of the room. And again, we have individual travelers and we have groups. So we do have families traveling as well. So we might have individual rules where we're not allowed to use the top bunk. Then we might have a group who's been traveling for 2 weeks, and I would then say for them to use the entire room. So that's really where my head's at, and probably on the big group checkouts where they've used the whole room, the next day will have to be a deep clean. So we might not be able to check in and check out during the same day, if that's shedding some light on the situation.
No, thank you. That's a great help. Teresa, if I can ask you from a guest house perspective and a B&B perspective, I mean, I've been reading obviously a lot of documents between the Department of Health and WHO, and there have been some recommendations around, allocating alternate rooms. But how do you see this panning out in a smaller environment, especially on a B&B side?
Thanks, Belinda. I'm concerned that we, don't create a blunt instrument again for an entire industry where we try to regulate with the same procedures for everybody. And I think just in this conversation, we've seen already there's a big difference between a game lodge or a backpacker. And I think the same with apartments and small guest houses. Obviously, if you only have 3 rooms, you can't just do alternate rooms. I think what's important is that, and that somebody asked this question as well on our chat group. Christopher asked, will the accommodation sector agree on a common set of principles or standard operating procedures, or will there be some flexibility? And I think it's important that we establish guidelines, but think about why we're doing that. Who is it that we want to protect? It's both the guest house owner, and certainly with guest houses and B&Bs, one of the first questions that we got as a company from our clients was, do I ask somebody now, do I only allow them for a check-in if they have a certificate? And we said, well, we can't even do enough testing, so I don't think you're going to be able to say, I only let you in if you have a certificate that shows you have antibodies. And a lot of people are saying, really, we want guests, so how can we make them comfortable? So I think many of the same rules and the common sense principles that apply everywhere else need to apply here. So a lot of it, I think, is going to be around, I read the term somewhere that says cleanliness theatre. And in a sense, that is that you show that you're cleaning when you have people there, so that it's that confidence, establishing the confidence that you're not just saying we have these checklists, but that you make them available to clients to say, these are the things that we're checking. I think much like what Rob did there. the checking was a question, and somebody else also asked about whether the World Health Organization protocols, are going to apply here. And I think, again, those need to be evaluated very carefully, depending on the type of property that you're doing it for. They're sort of saying, well, stick a line that's a distance from reception. Yeah, great if you're a hotel, but doesn't really work if you're a small guest house. Online check-ins and dropping keys is fine, but then you have the matter of where you need to check credit cards to see and identity documents to make sure that you now don't open yourself up to fraud again. So there's a lot of things to think about, and I suppose my fear is that, and that's why it's so great that SATSA is trying to get ahead of this, that as an industry we're saying these are the things that might apply for different areas. Here is an idea, here are the principles. This is what we suggest as a guideline. Apply that to what works for you and publicize it so that people know what steps you're taking. But I think to be careful not to impose incredibly high costs, that a larger hotel or a 5-star game lodge could potentially afford versus a small apartment or B&B owner. There were also quite a few questions around, are we going to look for subsidies for sanitizer and masks and these other things? And, I think we have to be clever, boxing clever around costs, and that in our attempt to guide and help, that we don't now impose additional costs on small business owners through this process. So, some of the other WHO things were the booking 1 day distance apart so that you have time to deep clean the property. And I think, again, that depends on the size of the property or the room. So maybe something more practical is for some other people to say, well, we have a slightly earlier checkout and a later check-in to leave us that time to actually deep clean the room, depending on all the things that you need to clean. So I suppose I want to advocate not for a one-size-fits-all, but for some guidelines that people can apply, and with advice, and that guest confidence is the main thing that we have to establish to get people back into our properties.
Teresa, thank you. I think you've touched on some really pertinent points there. One of the questions that came up, and I see it was on the previous conf call as well around the transportation, is there are suggestions around ozone machines to bring them in to disinfect the rooms. Do you think that is viable? Do you think even from a small to a large establishment, do you think that would be an option?
Belinda, is that a question for me? I personally don't know what ozone machine costs, but I know that people are at this point, struggling to pay their web subscriptions to keep their websites live. So I think, it's a good example of something that might be a fantastic idea, but that is going to work for a privileged few and not for many people whose, really sole income is the accommodation where they have 2, 3, 5 or 7 rooms.
No, and I agree with you. And even if I had to put on a Sorgo-san hat, and if you're cleaning up a 500-bedroom hotel, and that's why I ask if it really is a viable solution. So, but I'm just fielding some interesting questions here. Rob, can I come back to you just from a food handling perspective? What is your take, and be it from a small, large, or slightly bigger, but what is your ideas on social distancing around kitchen staff, around changing delivery? If I remember correctly, you moving away from buffet services. What would be your ideas around this?
I guess, let's start with where the food gets delivered. So we're going to put into, I guess, lodge is not too different to a home. So, if you go shopping and you buy your food, some houses are practicing it, some aren't. But when you get your goods back, you got your sanitizer and you spray your items, and you reduce the risk of a virus getting in. So we would do that on all arrivals and deliveries. we would have an individual there wiping down the boxes, etc. And then assuming that if that is done effectively, then the food that has arrived into the cold rooms, etc., then it is you know, it's been sanitized and it's safe. And then, you know, the next item to come into the kitchen are your staff. So I guess there again, it's the preventative measures that we have in as they enter in the kitchen, which is normal standard practices at the moment, but obviously a little bit more heightened awareness around this. So washing hands, wearing face masks, making sure all those procedures are really in place, but adhered to absolutely. And then again on the output of it is you know, individual. It's already been referenced earlier on. Brent spoke of it, where you do individual plated meals, and so a la carte menu, spacing between the tables, you know, try and achieve that social distancing. Luckily, I mean, in a lodge, we are blessed with space, you know, and that's not, you know, that's really not applicable to many accommodation establishments. So the lodge industry, again, as I mentioned, operates like an island, so it's easier to prevent the virus from arriving. Not saying that it's a guarantee, but it's certainly easier. And then the logistics of operating a guest experience with space gives you a lot more flexibility and options. So yeah, I hope those are, yeah, but yeah, again, looking at our hotels, far more complicated environment, people living off site, you know. So what we've done as well at the lodges with our staff, instead of doing a 3 weeks on, 1 week off, which is our normal work roster, we're going to do 6 and 2. So therefore we have less movement of people in and out. Those are just one of the procedures that we're going to put in place to reduce the movement of potential someone coming in who is contaminated.
Rob, thank you. Thanks for that. That's great. Brent, if I can come back to you, there's quite a few questions that are coming up around communal areas. I'm speaking spa, from sauna, fitness facilities, you know, swimming pools. How do you envision this going forward? Do you see them temporarily being closed, or how do you see the industry managing these communal areas?
Yeah, you know, Belinda, I think, you know, again, as I spoke to, those are high risk areas because you've got a number of different people coming into one space. And, you know, so I think extra precautions are going to have to be taken in those particular areas. You know, we've spoken about sort of like areas like our kids entertainment or sort of kids zones where, you know, we're going to have to make sure that those are cleaned multiple times per day. When the kids arrive or the parents drop off the kids, that they sanitize their hands before going into it and you know, and kind of just applying extra precautions. And the same would probably apply to the likes of a gym, a swimming pool area where, you know, you would just try and have to supply a fresh set of towels, make sure the equipment is wiped down on a regular basis. And if possible, you know, if your operation can provide for it, that they try and sort of wipe it down, say after every sort of use, you know. Now, if you've got a busy gym, that might be very difficult to handle, but, you know, I think it's really, we just got to take every precaution we possibly can. And I think Teresa touched on it. A lot of it is giving the guest confidence in terms of, you know, in terms of utilizing these facilities. And I think if we can, you know, illustrate that we're taking, you know, kind of, you know, reasonable, if not, or even, you know, beyond adequate kind of steps to try and be as hygienic as possible and spread, you know, and restrict the virus spread, then I think guests will have the confidence to utilize these facilities. You know, I think there's only so much we can do within a kind of practical and reasonable sort of, you know, kind of element. That obviously bears in mind costs and personnel and et cetera. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to just applying wherever we can additional hygiene steps. And I think it both comes from a staffing perspective as well as a guest perspective. I think we've all become accustomed to cleaning our hands on a more regular basis, arriving at the shops and wiping down you know, our hands before taking a trolley or walking into the supermarket. So I think, you know, what's happening, as long as we're providing the services or the kind of sanitation stations or whatever it might be when you arrive in these things, I think both guests and staff alike can kind of probably do a particularly good job of trying to kind of just minimize that risk. Yeah, I think if I can just also add to that, I mean, you know, we've spoken about other areas of concern or kind of, you know, if you take things like, you know, where you might have quad bikes or go-karting as an activity, you know, guys are wearing helmets or they're wearing kind of horse riding caps, which are now kind of generally probably not the most hygienic things that you possibly, you know, could have, because it's, you know, you got one session in the morning and one a couple hours later, and now they're utilizing the same helmets. How do we go about sterilizing those and cleaning those things, you know? So we've kind of touched on with some of our properties in terms of maybe trying to steam those things, spray them down, let them air out. So, and it can work where you've maybe got a lot of kind of helmets or things like that, where you can kind of allow them time to sort of clean. But I think there's going to be all these kind of smaller operational challenges that are going to come into every aspect of the business, which I think probably we all haven't kind of given thought to yet. But, as the kind of situation unfolds and operations get going, you're going to kind of have to consider these sort of smaller elements of your operations. Yeah.
Thanks, Brent. I'm going to throw a question out here, and I don't know who might be able to answer, but there's quite a few of these questions filtering through now. The guys are asking around, is there going to be an SOP around sanitizing a room? What do we refer to be guidelines on how to sanitize a room effectively? And adjacent to that, is the industry going to have a standard hygiene certificate? I think those are really valid points. How does this, how is this controlled at a greater level? I don't know if anybody wants to answer that one.
Belinda, I'm happy to have a first stab. And I think a lot of this is, will probably be, kind of taking lead probably from some of the big operations as well. The guys like the Sun Internationals, the Tuchel, the Marriotts, where I'm assuming they're probably going to apply a lot more kind of thought to this to make sure that they kind of comply with global and international standards. But I think, what we've said to our guys is, let's engage with your housekeeping executives. Let's also engage with your various, cleaning supply or, hygiene, contractors and suppliers, because very often they've got kind of training and recommendations, and they're obviously vying for business, and they realize that this is obviously a great opportunity to kind of improve sales and, sell additional kind of hygiene products. So, call on your suppliers to assist with best practice kind of SOPs and recommendations. And that goes through from, kind of cleaning the various surfaces of bathrooms and kitchens, right through to, laundry treatment, and things like that. So, I think, I think it's something that I think through these forums, we should try and create a sort of best set of, a best practice set of SOPs, which then everyone can leverage off. And I think over time, as we start getting closer to operating dates, I think these things will come to light, like the World Group's done and put on their website, which I think, the smaller guys can kind of steal from and try and implement.
Thanks, Brent. I appreciate you taking a stab at it. It's quite a big one, and there was a recommendation whether, do we get the star grading council involved in that? And I think this is very much a long-term strategy, and I definitely think it's going to change the way we do business long-term, and very much coming back to what everybody's been saying. It's really about establishing confidence. The smaller B&Bs, Teresa, I would imagine, the consumer wants to know that all those tick boxes have been done. Teresa, one of the questions that came in, and I don't know if you would like to answer this, is whether there is opportunity for guest houses to be used as quarantine facilities. I don't know if you've come across that much so far.
Sorry, I just tried to unmute myself and then deleted the video. We have had several questions about that, and there are a few Knightsbridge clients who have registered as essential services. So, if they're in an area near a hospital, so it is possible. And many of these protocols that you're talking about now are then being applied by the guest houses. Many people have seen this as a potential opportunity to actually host guests at the moment and get some income. And there was also an initiative with Ubuntu Beds to make this as free accommodation for health workers. But I think a lot of people are looking at it as an opportunity to actually also still be able to do a little bit of business to get some revenue. I think, and it's interesting, because if you're going to open as an essential service, those levels of cleanliness and wearing gowns and masks and aprons and so on might be at a much higher level, and probably needs to be a lot more visible than it would be as a protocol for further down the line when you are welcoming guests. And actually there's probably a little bit of a risk that in the way that we market how clean we are and what we put on our websites and how we eventually promote our offerings, that we don't turn all of our accommodations into anything that looks kind of like a hospital environment. And I think it's fine for somebody who's doing essential services, but not further down the line if they want to do something else. Some of those questions have been, and maybe some of the panelists, some of the attendees can share some ideas for people who have done that, how and where they then promote those facilities. I mean, our recommendation is just to go to the facilities near them or get in contact with the hospitals and police stations and other essential workers that might need accommodation. Yeah, I must say one of my favorite memes through this period was a video that I saw of an Italian grandmother in Italian who said, listen people, a lot of what we're talking about is simply good manners. This is what your mama taught you. Don't sneeze on someone, wash your hands, shower before you jump into the pool. And I suppose actually a little bit of what we're struggling with is that many people don't have good manners. But we also have to be reminded of that. Many of the things that we're saying do or don't do are things that we kind of consider good hygiene generally, that people don't apply, and making it a rule is not necessarily going to change that. And quite often, and again, that thin line between saying you have to do this and you have to do that, otherwise you can't open. Remember that people look at guest reviews, and I'm sure it will be a similar thing if we can get to the point where people actually review South Africa and South African accommodations as having a protocol and saying all of these guest houses have sort of a checklist that they publish to say these are the things that we actually do. We can get a long way ahead in establishing that confidence without having to go a long route of having a regulation in place, or even a very specific kind of grading in place, which you then have to pay to get or not to get. And, so my concern, and certainly from presenting our group of properties, is also is cost too.
Thank you, Teresa. I know there was a question to say, will game drives continue? Rob, I know you've already touched on you're going to move your maximum number of packs from 6 to 4 per private game drive. I would imagine that there is quite a big sanitation process then after every game drive. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, my hesitation around is that I think where practically possible without physically wiping down the guest, I think we're going to be sanitizing any areas where we need to apply best practice. I think the other, I think the other overarching kind of theme of this conversation is we need to give thought to all these recommendations within a certain timeline. It's moved so incredibly quickly. We also know that ultimately this virus is, whether we like it or not, we're probably all going to have it within the next 18 to 24 months. So does that mean then we're going to go back to how we normally operated, which is running very clean, well-run establishments, delivering a great guest experience, regardless of what type of guest experience one is operating? So my point is that I think it's a balancing act between preventative and slowing down and being considerate and aware, and impacting the guest who's still coming to you, be it on business travel or leisure travel. So I think it's trading off those. And then again, these decisions, as I mentioned right in the beginning, they're very dynamic. I think this time in a month, our worlds are all going to look very different. And therefore, I think heavy long-term legislation around how we do things, which I think as an industry, we actually have an incredibly high standard across all sectors within the industry. I don't think we want to be looking to government to introduce very strict new rules that we have to then adhere to for a longer term process. I think let's hope that in the first quarter of next year, our lives are starting to normalize hopefully before then. But that's actually, at the moment, it feels like a lifetime, but that's 9 months away. And therefore, I think each month and each decision and each action we have in place is dependent upon how guests are perceiving the crisis at that time, how they're arriving. At the moment, our occupancies are not looking very good, as you can imagine. So we have lots of room, we have lots of space, we have lots of extra staff to do these additional sanitizing exercises. But obviously, hopefully, as the book recovers and it gets busier, then that's going to become more impractical, and we're going to have to be dynamic and move again. So, just in closing, I think we live in an incredibly dynamic world. I think we've moved forward incredibly well as an industry in implementing where and what we can to bring back the confidence in travel. And then I think we'll change our behaviors as we need to, as the kind of confidence is restored. And I guess as more people get it, as that kind of herd immunity point is reached, which it will do at some point, that in itself will then again change our behaviors.
Rob, thank you so much. I think you've really touched on it. It's I think the most common word has become the word fluid, and as you say, it's changing by the hour, if not sooner. So I think you've touched on it, and I think if we all look at a short-term and a long-term strategy through this, I think it's definitely going to change our behavior and the way we do business for the positive, because as you say, if there's a repeat in this, it's got to become business unusual. So I think that's absolutely critical. I think the one thing that we perhaps haven't touched on, and I'm sure this will come up in another session, is what is going to happen in the meeting space and the GNC space. And I know there's been several discussions, looking at maximum numbers, whether we take those big convention centers and move them to almost a 50% capacity versus 100%. So where you've got a normal conference venue that's taken 1,000 people, are we going to throttle that back to 500? So I don't know if that's a question for this forum, but what I would like to say, or just ask, is maybe in closing, if I can just go around and ask each of the panelists if there's anything you want to touch on. Tim, if I can start with you, you've been fairly quiet, but if I can maybe ask you if there's anything you might want to add to this discussion.
Yes, thanks, Belinda. So at the heart of the youth space is generally common in communal areas. We've got to really think about that. So putting best practice aside, there's probably two trains of thought within our establishments. And for me, it was basically give your guests a survival kit, their mug, plate, knife, fork, a little box, some tea and coffee, and off they go. They must cook and clean all their own cutlery and crockery. Or the guest mustn't be cleaning any of their cutlery and crockery, and the establishment must be taking it on. So that's one point I've missed out. And then for us, I think we've got a little more creativity in our youth spaces to apply funny little tricks or games. So if you can think, we bought hula hoops at our backpackers, and basically there's 20 odd hula hoops lying around. So if we're in the bar and you want to social distance each other, you put your hula hoop on, and you shouldn't ever come into contact with each other. So it's just a different way of thinking out of the box in terms of how to implement these things without drawing lines and having rules and checklists up everywhere. So for me, that's what would be where my head goes towards, is trying to make it a little more fun, perhaps, rather than a checklist that the guest needs to complete every time they do something. Have a little game around it, or something creative that sort of incentivizes them to behave in a certain way. And then probably removing high touch points, books, items, pamphlets, magazines for a certain period. That's for me quite a big one. Within the lodges, we're trying to sell all our suppliers stuff, and we don't want to be locally transmitting via a pamphlet. And otherwise, I just want to say thanks to everyone. Thanks for having me. And catch me on email. Happy to answer further questions or on a phone call anytime. Thanks, Belinda.
Tim, thank you very much. That's great. I love your points there. It's really, really pertinent points. So thank you. There is a quick question here around the curio shops in the lodges. I think you were touching on high touch points. I don't know what this question really. Okay, I'm going to move on. Teresa, anything you?
I see some more questions around the communication strategy, and I certainly think that's a very important part of marketing, and that's where I think more properties have done a really fantastic job, because that will be a question for people once they start looking at accommodation again. And I suppose for a while, people who travel might have to get used to the accommodations where they stay looking a little bit more empty than they did in the past, as Tim said, with fewer pamphlets or curios and knickknacks, and or the way that you deal with your tables, whether you're going to be putting a paper overlay over your tablecloth. I think for many of those things, just to illustrate to guests. And I think on the marketing side, those are the kinds of things that you need to do. And from the Knightsbridge side, we have a blog on our website where we're trying to gather, like we did here today, lots of ideas, and hopefully we can help there also by providing the outcome of these discussions to more people than the ones who were able to attend today and outside of all of the other associations. I think if we can come up with a type of a checklist that maybe different associations say, you're saying, I'm a member of SATSA and this is the checklist that I work with. These are the types of things that we do every day, so that you do have a little bit of backing from an association or that you're already part of, instead of having to go and do another application or applying to a regulatory environment. If we can kind of come up with some of those ideas ourselves and implement them well.
Teresa, thank you. That's super. Brent, is there anything you might want to add in closing?
Belinda, I think for me, it's probably just about kind of finding the right balance between sort of I think in terms of business and how we move forward with this, because I think we all of us around this forum are in for some tough times. We on the sort of generally the kind of probably the more nice to haves or the luxury side of the consumer market. So I think the reality is that our margins are tight already, in even in good times. So now we're going into kind of tougher financial times. Is I think guys mustn't kind of maybe overthink elements of the operations and kind of overburden their cost structures or their cost or their personnel structures in terms of trying to kind of maybe take the SOPs too far. I think it's a matter of applying some common sense in the various aspects and trying to work within your operational kind of constraints that you've got, because I think we can otherwise kind of just put ourselves on the back foot where we can't recover, and I think we need to be that smart and be clever in this tough time. So I think it's just about finding that right balance as an operation in terms of how you move forward through this next chapter. Yeah.
I see Belinda's still on mute, so perhaps, anyway, I think she probably meant to hand over to Rob. So Rob, let you have the final say.
Okay, to me or David? To me. No, my final thought on the matter is I do believe that whether we like it or not, this virus is going to become part of our communities and our society. I think all of our at the moment is to slow the curve and restore and ensure our industry survives this. So we desperately trying to restore confidence, get the economy moving again, get people traveling again. But I think in a year's time, once it is reached, because the experts know that it can't be contained, and it is going to gradually, incrementally spread into our communities. And I think therefore it will be a way of life into the future. We'll be having flu vaccines and we'll be having COVID-19 vaccines. And I think that our approach remains dynamic. I couldn't agree more with what Brent was saying in terms of we mustn't overreact and over respond. We need to keep calm. We need to keep focused on managing our cost structure so we get through this. And then gradually, as the economy and as guests start traveling again, we need to be there to receive them and give them a great experience, be it on, as I mentioned, be it business travel or leisure travel. So I'm optimistic about the future, but also very wanting to recommend we all keep very calm and very steady and just gradually get through this. And I'm very confident that the industry will bounce back in the near to medium term, or the medium to long term.
Linda, I see you back.
So sorry, we lost satellite, so I've moved into 3G. I'm hoping this is a bit better. I really feel like I'm calling in from space here, but thank you so much. And I think from my side, guys, there's just been so many insights, and especially offline, even from our guest dialing in, there's been some great suggestions. So
I'm going to mute Linda.
I don't know if I'm jumping in here, but as far as everybody who's dialed in, so that I'm going to go.
Okay, sorry, Belinda, I've muted you. Sorry, please forgive me. I just want to hand over to David just to give us a parting shot before we log off. And my thanks, everyone, for contributing. If you do have any additional insights, you're welcome to send those through to communications@satsa.co.za. We have until this evening to compile everything. Tight turnaround. Please send them through to communications@satsa.co.za. David, over to you.
Thanks, Natalia, and thanks to Belinda and the panelists. Thanks for your time, guys, and just for the thought leadership. I mean, this is how we drive the process collectively. Although we're all sitting at home, by having these webinars and the incredible interest and input that we've got from everybody, the 500 people who've clocked in has been amazing. So just from a SATSA point of view, I mean, we certainly some thoughts. We've got a board session on Friday, but we will certainly have a look at the single sourcing option. I think that makes sense rather than everybody running out trying to do their own thing. So once again, if we can have, what are the essential items that we need to be looking at, and we can communicate that through to Natalia, that would be great. And then I like Teresa's point around, we've got to get some minimum standards established, but let's look at a process of self-regulation rather than a sort of heavy-handed sort of government approach to this. And if we can get a compliance checklist in a similar way that we do a lot of the other SATSA compliance items, I think that, that's something we can explore as well. But just once again, thanks to you guys, thanks for your time, and just thanks for the incredible interest that people have shown, not only in this session, but in a lot of the other webinars that we have had, and we'll be continuing to drive the process forward. It's the beginning of a process, guys, and I think that the way that we're coming together is really exemplary. So from my side, thanks very much.
And on that note, my thanks to everyone for joining us today. Please stay safe, and we will catch you the next time we have a webinar. Cheers, everyone. Bye.